Hi, my name is Kia Johnson, and I'm presenting work with Molly Babel. It's based on a paper, and you can find a link to the preprint of that paper in the slide footer. The title of our project is Language Contact Within the Bilingual, Adapting a Model from Sound Change to Cross-Linguistic Influence. A quick note before I dive into the talk is that I will be at the Q&A session, but since it's 3 a.m. in my time zone, I might be a bit sleepy. Molly and I are planning to hold a bonus QA session on July 14th at 6 p.m. Central European Time. I'll post the Zoom link for that in the comments for this video. So I wanted to lead with this quote, and it's the idea that the locus of language contact is the bilingual speaker. It ties ideas from cross-linguistic influence to ideas from research on language contact at the community level and suggests that the two are not so different. This perspective emphasizes the role that bilinguals have to play in contact-induced language change. And I see cross-linguistic influence as one clear example of that kind of contact. It's arguably where contact-induced change starts. And while we might usually look at it from an individual level, I think that cross-linguistic influence is something that can give us a good snapshot of what's happening at a community or group level as well. A couple of other things familiar to those in this audience at ISB is that cross-linguistic influence is bidirectional, and it's also asymmetrical. So while any of an individual's languages are subject to influence from the others, they don't necessarily influence each other to the same degree. And there are a lot of different accounts for that asymmetry. Some common ones that you see are things like language dominance, age of acquisition, language mode, and recency of use. These accounts cover a lot of ground, but they also largely reflect linguistic experience, and they are by definition highly individual in nature. There's another proposal that I've seen kind of anecdotally in the literature, and it's the idea that sometimes when categories are linked, one of the two categories has more room to vary, and that this room to vary means that it's more susceptible to influence. So a good example of this, and the one where you typically see it, is that languages with long lag stops, so English, for example, is going to be more subject to influence than a language with short lag stops. And the reason for this really is that long lag stops, typically some 80 milliseconds of aspiration, you can cut that in half, and the stop's still going to be perceived as a long lag stop, whereas the short lag stop is going to be much more tightly bounded on either side. So there's just not as much room to move around. The idea here, I think, is a really interesting one, but it's not one that's gained a lot of traction in the cross-linguistic influence literature. But at the same time, it is something that you see in work on other kinds of language contact. And there's really not a great reason for why you don't see a ton of crosstalk between those different lines of research. And I think that this is something that a recent Yao and Chang paper really highlights. It's just this division of labor between people who study second language acquisition and bilingualism and those who study areas like sound change and historical developments of languages. And one of their points is that these areas inform each other in interesting ways, and maybe they shouldn't be so separate. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. We're following their lead, and it ended up being a really useful tool for us here because the idea that differences in variability might drive phenomena is something that has been grappled with in the sound change literature. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to adapt an idea from sound change. A recent model proposed by Harrington and colleagues accounts for the direction of a sound change based purely on the relationship between two distributions. So the figure here is pulled from their 2018 paper, and while it explains the model using 2 dimensions, this idea would work just as well for 1 or more than 2. In this example, you've got 2 versions of a category, X and Y, and you're interested in how these categories influence each other along that solid line. In this dimension, Y is a lot more variable than X. So if you had something in the middle, you'd be more likely to say that it's a Y rather than an X. And over time, what this means is that the Y distribution shifts towards the X distribution. And this is something that Harrington and colleagues have demonstrated both with modeling and with empirical data. It's a little bit weird to think about this if you haven't before, but the basic idea is that the less variable group stands its ground, while the more variable group closes in. The idea that distributions matter is not a new idea, but at the same time, the place where you see this the most is in this idea of compactness, and what we're doing here is really quite different from that. So, what are we doing with this framework? Well, we're proposing that the internal structure of matched categories predicts asymmetry in cross-linguistic influence, and that this has cascading effects for things like language contact and sound change. Basically, we ask, does the less variable category constrain or guide the production of the more variable category? And our hypothesis here effectively is yes. Okay, so in broad terms, I'll go over the general method first. There's 2 studies, and each looks at a different asymmetry across English and Cantonese. And in both cases, it's an instance where Cantonese is going to constrain English, according to our hypothesis. So we used 3 corpora. Each of them represents a different speech community, the bilinguals we focused on, and then 2 different English-speaking comparison corpora. From these corpora, we identified the segments of interest, and then we measured and manually coded them, and kept track of a bunch of different control variables. So with this data set, we then compared bilingual speech production patterns to the control groups using generalized linear mixed effects models. A little bit more about those materials before I jump into the first study. The bilingual data comes from the English half of the SPICE corpus, which is a new open access bilingual speech corpus with conversational interviews that we've developed over the last few years here in Vancouver. The first of the comparison corpora is the corpus of transnational West Coast English. It's a collection of sociolinguistic interviews with English speakers in Seattle and Vancouver, and here we're using the subset of talkers from Vancouver that don't have experience with any Chinese language, though many of them do know some French. And we also included a non-local comparison group. And so this is the Buckeye corpus, which is a very widely studied group of speakers. And it's a different speech community in North America. And I'll add that we just used the young participants from that group. Okay, so with these 3 data sets, I'll move on to the first study that we did. Okay, so here we looked at voicing for voiced intervocalic stops. This is a prime example of a variability asymmetry across English and Cantonese. So in English, stop voicing is extremely variable. So that's sort of depicted in this cartoon as an orange wide distribution. On the other hand, Cantonese lacks voiced stops. In fact, it lacks a voiced obstruents entirely. So we're going to just have to assume that in conversational speech, there's going to be some degree of voicing, just like spillover from either side. But that black line there you see is really just our sort of assumption that it's going to be a much tighter distribution and it's going to be much closer to the no voicing end of the spectrum. And our prediction then is that the Cantonese English bilinguals are going to produce less stop voicing during closure in their English speech than the other 2 groups are. So relatively straightforward prediction. All right. In this study, we identified intervocalic word medial B, D, and G. With these items, we then manually coded them as good, deletion, or transcript error. So this is something we did to sort of bring the SPICE and CTWCE corpora onto a comparable level of the Buckeye, since there was a difference between the first 2 being force-aligned and the Buckeye being manually aligned. So then with our final set of good tokens, we measured the proportion of voicing during closure and tracked a number of control variables. And then lastly, we modeled the proportion of voicing as a beta distributed response variable in a generalized linear mixed effects model. So I'm not going to go over the model details in this talk, but I encourage you to take a look at our paper for lots more details on things like variable specification and coding. The main result from our study is indeed consistent with our hypothesis. So in this plot, each panel represents the distribution of proportion voiced for a particular corpus and stop. It does this with a box plot paired with a density plot. So first off, this environment is indeed highly voiced. The distributions are pretty stacked towards the top in every panel. However, it's also clear that talkers in the SPICE corpus tend not to be quite as fully voiced. So the distributions are more spread out, and the median value is a little bit lower. The Buckeye corpus is by far the most consistently fully voiced, while the other local comparison group, so the CTWCE, kind of falls sort of in the middle. So we see a little bit of a gradient pattern. So the takeaways here is that, yes, our prediction held up. Bilinguals produce less voicing during closure. It's most evident with the non-local comparison, but shows up for the local comparison as well for B. The effect sizes are small, but given that this is an environment that strongly favors voicing, it's perhaps not surprisingly small. And the control variables, they all patterned as expected. So that sort of helps make us feel more confident in the result. We also did a second model that looked at a handful of language mode variables just within the SPICE corpus. And there really wasn't a lot going on there. There were no significant effects, although one of them was marginal. So the first of them, and the one that's depicted here, is interview order. So whether the participant in the SPICE corpus did their Cantonese interview first or not. And in this case, we see the value is a little bit lower. So there's less voicing if they did Cantonese first than the other way around. And this is what we would expect, but it wasn't significant, and it's not something that we can draw firm conclusions about. We also considered proximity to a code switch, though there wasn't a lot of code switching in the English interviews, and we didn't see any effect in the models. Okay, so study 2. It has a very similar structure to the first, but it focuses on a different asymmetry, and that asymmetry is word final PTK releases. So this is another example of an asymmetry across English and Cantonese. We see English stop releases are really highly variable. There is some social information going on there too, so we can't just sort of say like any kind of speech. It's something that's going to be conditioned like by a wide number of things. But the point is, it is variable, and on the other hand, it's not in Cantonese. So in Cantonese, stops are just unreleased in final position. So again, our prediction here is that invariance in Cantonese, which you see in our sort of schematic on the right of just Cantonese being heavily stacked in a couple of those boxes, and English being kind of more spread out across a bunch of those boxes. So what our prediction is here then, is that bilinguals are going to be more likely to produce unreleased final stops in English compared to local and non-local English speakers. But given that this is something that has some social salience to it, we're going to say like, okay, this prediction is really constrained to the casual speech that we're working with. In this study, we thus identified a word final PTK that occurred before a vowel or approximant. So that's whatever the next word started with. We then manually coded them into released, unreleased, lenition, glottalization, deletion, and transcript error. So it's a lot of different categories. We ultimately removed any errors and deletions, as well as the P tokens. So the reason for that is just because there weren't very many of them. We then modeled whether or not a stop surfaced as unreleased. So unreleased here is clear closure, no release, using a logistic mixed effects model. And so this does lump together releases, lenition, and glottalization all kind of into one category. And that might be a bit unfair, but it does get at our core question of whether or not bilinguals are more likely to show the Cantonese-like behavior, that is, the unreleased stops. So the main result from study 2 is that bilinguals are indeed more likely to produce unreleased stops than either of the comparison groups. So you see that in the sort of dark purple bars at the bottom. Much like the previous one, we also looked at effects of language mode, and in this case, there was no effective interview order or code switches. We also looked at release rates here, and what was really interesting there is that, especially for T, the two local groups have really, really low release rates. So they weren't different in that sense, but they were kind of abnormally low and very different from the Buckeye corpus. And so this kind of maybe hints at some sort of regional feature going on here. But again, the takeaway from this study is really that the bilinguals produce more unreleased stops. Again, these are still small effect sizes, but considering that this environment does favor releases, it helps us feel confident that like our hypothesis was maintained. Again, here the control effects largely pattern as expected. There were some interesting interactions with duration. So T and K had different patterns, but we attribute this largely to the fact that a majority of the K tokens were the word like. So there is a lot to unpack in this study, and I'm going to focus on two things in the discussion. So the first is that it's important to do corpus work. The reason I bring this up is because our results do contradict a previous lab study on stop releases. So Polinsky did a study with Cantonese English bilinguals in California and found them more likely to produce stop releases than age-matched peers who did not speak Cantonese. We found the opposite. I think Polinsky would likely agree the difference between these two cases is context. Polinsky's participants produced formal citation-style speech, and presumably the experimenter was not a member of their speech community. In our case, the corpus reflects peer-to-peer speech, where the interview was a bilingual from the same community as the participant, and they were conversing relatively freely. So in Polinsky's case, it sort of suggests hyperarticulation and clear speech is going to be the mode to be in, whereas the corpus data that we present in this study is very much like peers on the same level, or at least very close, having a conversation. It's not really the type of scenario that you associate hyperarticulation with. So I think this is kind of an important distinction to bring. And then I'll just also add that we don't argue that releases never occur. We just say that they occur less often, which feeds into the second bullet on this slide. And that's the idea that in order to capture a variable pattern, so one where sometimes you get a release, sometimes you don't, sometimes you get voicing, sometimes you don't, you need to have natural variation. And that's really quite a bit harder to collect in a lab in a formal setting. So if you want to capture variable patterns, you need to go to the kinds of speech where people produce variable patterns. And I think this is something that corpus work really has to offer. And yeah, by doing both the lab work and the corpus work, I think that we can sort of develop better theories and models in bilingualism. Okay, so the second point in this discussion that I want to talk about is basically our main finding, and that's the idea that differences in the degree of phonetic variation across categories can offer an explanation for why cross-linguistic influence manifests the way that it does. So why does it flow in one direction and not the other? This is one account of that that is purely based on the distributions of the sounds involved. I think this builds on our understanding of how cross-linguistic influence works, especially for categories that are kind of linked together already. So we know that being close together and being really similar means you get linked. But what happens after that? This is one answer. Though I do think it is important to cast this work as a proof of concept. So yes, we successfully adapted a sound change model on a conceptual level, but at the same time, there are some limitations that are important to highlight. And the two really are, we only show a single direction, so Cantonese influencing English, and then we only look at the English. And then the second piece, or the second reason to temper the outcome here, is that the key results stem from small effect sizes. So this is a proof of concept. We show that it did work here, but ultimately it's a testable concrete mechanism and we want to see how it holds up. So we encourage you to explore this in your own work and we can't wait to see it. Thank you so much. There are a lot of people to thank for their contributions to this work, both for helping us do this particular project, as well as developing the SPICE corpus and reading versions of the manuscript. Lots of people to thank. And the last thing that I'll leave you with here is just an encouragement to read our paper. It's available at that link. You can also use our data. The corpus, the SPICE corpus is open access and freely available. And yeah, we look forward to connecting with you during IASB, both in the Q&A session, our bonus Q&A session, or via the methods I've listed here on this slide. So thank you so much.